Hello, my lovelies. I'm Jenny O, the author with no last name, and I'm also an editor, fashion designer, and game dip. Today, I want to talk about the muddled branding of Star Stable Online. Unlike my other branding videos, SSO is part of a franchise, with the original games being called Starshine Legacy. Now, I just want to remind you that I'm approaching this video from a marketing perspective. A badly marketed game doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad game overall. My opinion of Star Stable as a game and my opinion of Star Stable as a brand that is marketable is, okay, let me be honest a minute, both are dismal. But that's not always the case when it comes to media. You can have a good media branded and marketed badly, and bad media marketed and branded excellently. Whether or not the game as a game is good or bad, and the game's marketing is good or bad, are two different departments and skill sets. They don't always depend on each other. There are many variables on what makes a game good or bad, or the marketing successful or unsuccessful. I'm sitting here on my horse at Silverglade Castle, looking over the village because I feel this position right here is one of the clearest examples of the muddled, disorganized mess Star Stable Online has become. Fantasy Castle, contemporary Swedish-style village. Today, I believe, is a lesson about knowing your genre and your target market and how this will affect the rest of your brand. Let me tell you a little story about the origins of Jorvik according to Starshine Legacy and a very pretty video from SSO. A long time ago, before the Vikings were raiding everywhere, in this galaxy, a group of good aliens had fought a very long war against an evil alien called Garnock and his generals. The good aliens won and imprisoned Garnock in a starship on their way to exile him into a black hole or something. Not very clear what their intentions were to do with this ultimate evil. On their journey, as they were passing by this small watery planet we call Earth, Garnock and his generals managed to break free, and in doing so caused the ship to crash towards Earth. They jumped out to splash in the ocean next to a barren island in the Arctic Circle. One of the aliens, as far as we are aware, a bipedal horse alien named Dean, she jumped out after them, and raising her hand, she brought light and life to Jorvik from west to east, and imprisoned Garnock and his generals in a metaphysical plane or parallel dimension close to Jorvik called Pandoria. Now, that's the legendary and sanitized version. Imagine this. You're a group of highly advanced technological aliens. You have the ability to manipulate time and space one way or another because of your genetics. You've crashed onto a low technological planet of aliens descended from bonobo monkeys. You've barely managed to contain the ultimate evil you were imprisoning on the planet. Your ship or ships are in shambles. In a panic, you've ripped open a hole between dimensions and stuffed the evil into it, causing a great weakness to the veil between dimensions, which you hastily patched with some trees and stones imbued with nanotechnology, maybe. We don't know. So you think, oh, it'll be a few years. We can use our shape-shifting powers in the meantime to blend in, and we'll fix our ship, stuff the evil alienage generals back into it, and be on our way. They have a lot of information about this planet, so half of them shift into humans, and the other half shift into horses. And then there's Fripp, the squirrel. Maybe he's a different alien type. And then they realize they're stuck. They have to colonize. For a while, it's just the group from the ship keeping everything together. They use their technology to make sure they have a decent breeding population. birds appear. Fish appear in the waters because of birds. Deer and the like swim over from other places. But there's a lot of energy seeping out from the runestones and trees the aliens are using to hold Garnock in place. It makes things dangerous, changes things. They have to tend to Jorvik to make it just safe to live. And eventually humans, Norsemen, find the island and decide to settle it. As they do. And somewhere in the generations between the landing and the Jarl Jan landing on Jorvik's southern shore, the mysteries of a Dean has started among the aliens. The concept into every generation for the horses, and Adine and her daughter's abilities would be reincarnated. Or maybe that's 5 of the horses. To fight Garnock, eventually defeat him, and save the galaxy from his evil. Because the veil between the dimensions continues to unravel, Garnock is not content in his prison. He wants to escape. You know, that itself would make a good story. Elena, get on it. So, how did the aliens, who no doubt lived side by side with their alien horse cousins, how did they build houses and other structures? Did they use their powers? And what needs did these structures fulfill that were different than human needs? And how did the Norsemen arriving change their architecture and eventually their culture of feast days, holy days, and even dress? How would traditional Jorvik structures look today because of it? How many generations did it take for the aliens to go from herbivores to omnivores after marrying into the Norsemen? Did some remain separate? Are they the Vala or the Kelters or both? When did the Jorvik wild horses, the alien horses, go into hiding? And how is the energy of Pandoria seeping out of the land, changing everybody from the insects to the big animals to the humans and aliens themselves? Keep in mind the concept here. Bipedal horse aliens masquerading as humans, reincarnating into their descendants to take on the ultimate evil, the alien Garnock, imprisoned in a parallel dimension imposed by their equally masquerading as humans alien generals. Science fiction, horror. Pretty neat concept, right? And here we are. Fantasy castle, contemporary Swedish village. Well, this is kind of confusing. I need an explanation. It seems rather muddled, by which it means bewildering, confusion, and disorder. It seems we've got our branding mixed up. So, what is a brand? A brand is a particular product or image given a name and sold through distinctive design. The brand must answer the questions: what are we trying to say? Who are we trying to say it to? And how do we convey it visually? There are 4 elements of a brand: genre, target market, visual aesthetic, and core value/theme. This will translate into having a call to action fantasy tagline that is individual, hopefully, to the game, and the game mechanics that fit the genre and theme of the game. A genre is basically a category which can encompass what type of game it is and what the historical or story theme of the game. So this is where Star Stable has its very first problem. They have what they say they are versus what they actually are versus what the lore of the game says they are. Now, we've just gone over the lore from Starshine Legacy and what very little SSO has given us. And Starshine Legacy took place in the early 2000s when it was released, making it a contemporary science fiction horror game with horses. This should have carried over into Star Stable Online. Science that is not be able to be explained, essentially being magic for all points and purposes of this game. There is an alternate dimension you can get through by portals. The enemies are aliens, yes, from outer space, and the non-existent abilities of the main character come through being the reincarnation of one of these aliens. How? We're not sure exactly. So for contemporary, the village makes sense, despite it being culturally Swedish rather than culturally Jorvik. For science fiction or even horror, the castle makes no sense whatsoever. It's blatantly a fantasy castle rather than a horror genre castle. Now, what Star Stable says they are is a horse game. Massive multiplayer online role-playing game with the CEOs believing they are Harry Potter with horses. Now, if this was actually Harry Potter with horses, then okay, I can accept this castle, but I've done an entire 2-part video about how this isn't true. What they actually are is a kitchen sink of literary genres, massive multiplayer online game with horse collection, and basic cross-country racing and show jumping. What do I mean by kitchen sink? It means SSO is trying to throw every genre they can into this game in hopes of, I don't know, catching as many players as possible. So there are aliens from the original game, which is sci-fi. There are druids, there are witches, there are vampires, which are fantasy. There's steampunks and elements of cyberpunk with Big Bonnie and dark horror, which leans into niche genres of science fiction. We have Alberta Einstein and her brother Frank Einstein. Yes, Frankenstein. And their friend Igor. This is a nod to the origins of science fiction from Mary Shelley. There is a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde science fiction moment with Mr. Anwar. We have magical horses that change their coat colors and patterns. Some turn into fish, or kelpies, or even dragons. Back to fantasy. We have Pandoria, which they can't decide if it's a magical reality or an alternate dimension. We have sentient talking trees. We even have a restaurant area in the game in the Starshine Dude Ranch. We have the Headless Horseman. We have Krampus. So we have a form of fae. There are even ghosts, which could be either horror or paranormal fantasy. And on it goes. And if the genre of this game was Weird Western, in a way, I'd be okay with it. But even Weird Western has its own genre conventions and rules, and Star Stable fits none of them. This isn't even urban fantasy because of the sci-fi elements. You can have demons, and fae, and shapeshifters, but you can't have aliens in urban fantasy. Those are just the rules. Genres have rules and limitations and set expectations for players on what the game is going to be like. Fantasy and science fiction rest on the opposite ends of the speculative fiction spectrum. They can meet in the middle, the resting place of Star Wars, and superheroes, Dragonpunk. So in fantasy, you expect magic, okay? Mastery of the elements, magic missile, things are done through spells, the impossible is possible. Fantasy also tends to tackle different themes than science fiction. Science fiction, on the other end, deals with technology, alien, genetic capabilities, so making the probable possible. So the X-Men are science fiction, superhero, speculative fiction, whereas Doctor Strange is more fantasy, superhero, speculative fiction, even though they reside in the same universe, because superhero is its own thing which embraces science fantasy. Sci-fi is aliens and phasers and force fields, and fantasy is werewolves, wizards, magic, and swords. Sword and sorcery is an entire subgenre for a reason. So, if I said the game is Harry Potter with horses, then you'd expect to be riding around on horses, controlling the environment and elements through magical spells, fighting or working along fantasy-style monsters, which always somehow end up being spiders, and your alternate dimension always ends up being demon and hell-related for some reason, no matter how many gods you've got. If I say RPG in this context, you'd expect to have a sword mage role, a magical archer, and a straight-up wizard with a staff. Maybe a healer class. Look, it's not there because this isn't actually World of Horsecraft. So if I said sci-fi horror, then yes, you should expect Frankenstein and Cthulhu, who is Garnak in this context. And alternate dimensions could be anything from parallel universes to stepping into other worlds via a wormhole. You expect force fields and possibly time travel, and aliens, and spaceships. You'd expect if you had a genetic capabilities, it'd be to read thoughts or move things with the power of your mind, make plants grow, talk to animals. Maybe there is technology similar to the technology in Wakanda. And some of it is there, but we've got no control of it. There are no buttons for me to open a portal into Pandoria wherever I want. There's no talk to Chicken button. Our main skill is run away. We don't even have a decent dodge mechanic. Your genre sets the rules for your storytelling and your game mechanics. A science fiction game is a different type of mechanics and technology and storytelling than a fantasy game. The issue being science fiction is actually more niche than fantasy. So they've decided to try every single type of fantasy because, oh, it's cool to bring in more players, and because it wasn't put in a cohesive or coherent fashion, it's turned into this muddled mess. How do the powers of the aliens work versus the power of the witches? We don't know. It's not explained. Think of your genre as the cornerstone of your game. If you don't know your genre, then you're going to have a hard time figuring out who it's actually for in the target market. One of the foundation stones, and then you're going to have a difficult time figuring out your mechanics, the other foundation stones, much less building on top of it with a house of world building, characters, plot, conflict, and story arcs. The more and more genres you add into your world, the more and more boxes and rules and explanations and lore you have to work into your game, and the harder and harder it becomes to market due to the expectations of the players. So the house, instead of becoming a castle, becomes unstable and falls apart under the weight of its own conceit, unless there are rules thought out and put into place from the very beginning. Yes, this is the voice of experience. Which, if SSO had a plan, it's long gone. Which is why, instead of marketing this game on the story, they market the game as play with your friends and buy horses. The only reference to the story at all on the homepage is this very comical image of Alex running away from Mr. and Weir the monster. And because of this image, I've been told by multiple players they thought they'd be fighting monsters similar to Mr. Anweir around the map, or they want to be taking up arms and magic and going to fight Dark Core. Imagine their surprise to get into the game and there's virtually no combat at all and an endless amount of slice of life side quests. The mobile marketing doesn't even have that. Much of the marketing features them talking about their magical horses and enchanting world with images featuring Silverglade Castle often in the distance. They focus on the fantasy aspects of their game because fantasy, face it, is more popular than science fiction in the younger market. They can't market it as a horse game because they don't actually have horse game mechanics either. There is no endurance. There's no faults. There's no dressage to speak about. There's no mechanic to indicate when to jump. You and your horses cannot learn any skills. There's no agile horse, no fastest horse, no most disciplined horse to go along with it. There's no horse game story of winning championships to be the best rider. You just told you're the best rider. Constantly. Players want to know what type of story they're getting into. This way they can know what type of skills they're going to learn and have an idea the direction the story is going to go. And knowing the type of story is going to carry over to everything else. And SSO doesn't know what type of story they have because they've added so much into it. Their marketing has turned bland to the point of only for collectors and socializers because they can't carry their category into anything else, including their visuals. So, already, the brand for Star Stable Online versus Starshine Legacy is on shaky, sandy footing because it's focusing more on the fantasy aspects of all the elements it's got going on, when the core of the franchise story is science fiction horror. There are no clear rules in place to make it feel coherent. Many players can't even remember the story as it is. The next part of the brand is the target market. Who is this game for? And again, we have some contradictory answers to this question, and part of the reason maybe why I feel they're trying to lean more on fantasy than the science fiction origins of their lore. So the marketing materials are middle grade. That's 8 or 9. They put out on Apple, they believe the game is 9 plus. I've seen parents who are letting their 5 and 6-year-olds play this game. If your kids can't read, they probably shouldn't be playing this game, as there is no voice acting. There are times when SSO has to put up warnings on the website or in the news or even a pop-up in the game. The new quests might be scary for younger players. SSO says, despite the 9+ rating on their website, they want to hit the young adult 12 to 14 market. The story, prior to 2019, was definitely hitting that 12 to 14 market. They haven't, as far as I'm aware, changed it enough to lower that demo. The books they put out are for the young adult age group. You have these marketing materials that are very cheerful. Play with friends, collect horses, adventure, magical Jorvik, enchanting world. It's all very merry and fantasy-esque, and lots of pinks and purples and bright colors and sparkles to attract the younger market. And the story has horror elements and scary themes, for which in video games means you get that E10+ rating whether you like it or not. Video games rating services like PEGI and ESRB are very strict about what they consider E-rated or 3 and 7 rated games. SSO hits E10+ or 12 on either scale if you look at the actual content and not the marketing of the game. But hey, they've never submitted their game to PEGI or the ESRB to get a more unbiased, objective evaluation. The problem with them not being able to decide on a target market is target market sets the tone, visual atmosphere and design, and level of acceptability of violent, scary images and sexual innuendo allowed. SSO is a tween-teen game. I don't care how much pink and sparkles they slap on it. It's really for tweens and teens. Parents rely on games being honest about their target market in order to figure out what games are acceptable for their children to play. The way it is marketed versus the story is very confusing and very misleading on what you're going to get, which is again bad for your brand. You want people to be able to look at your product and be able to tell it's something they're interested in or not, and what age level the story and writing is going to be at. Teens don't want to be talked down to like they're 8 or 9. They don't want to be in this black and white world many young kids live in. Writing a story for YA is a lot different than a children's book or middle grade. If SSO doesn't itself know what their target market is, they can't set the writing tone for their story. This will alienate both players and parents. Now, I feel there is a reason why they are trying to lean into the fantasy elements rather than science fiction. There is a common misbelief young kids don't like science fiction. In fact, in the traditional publishing industry, it's very hard to find science fiction for young adult and middle grade. You'll find a lot of fantasy and science fantasy, which Star Wars falls under, but you won't find a lot of Star Trek, aliens or not aliens, pure science fiction type media. They don't know how to pitch it to young kids, which is ridiculous. Adventures on alien worlds sounds super fun from a kid perspective. Or in this case, let's take on tentacle monsters, go into alien dimensions, funsies. I think Animorphs is the closest you get to young adult, middle grade sci-fi. For the horror side of things, young kids get Goosebumps, Ghost Rider, and some episodes of the TV show Wishbone. They have an easier time pitching horror to kids than science fiction. Messed up little world, ain't it? But Star Stable wants to bring in these young kids who don't think about the future or how much money they're putting into the game to collect pretty horses and get digital pets. kids who will buy toys and not care there isn't a lot of content being put into the game. So we end up with this contradiction of a story that's got some very gray morality to it, and is scary and dark in places, at least for young adults. I'm a tad cynical and jaded here, being put into this bubblegum, sparkle, pink, brightly colored world. Now, if I thought this was intentional, I'd be all for it, because horror can be that jarring and cause that discomforting feeling, but the marketing would still have to reflect, oh, there's something dark going on under the surface. And it doesn't. Every horror type marketing they've done is very tongue-in-cheek, and I just can't take it seriously. My Little Pony did it better. So we have two very shaky cornerstones of this brand, the genre and target market. And I've mentioned already how this is playing out in the writing of the story. It's also playing out in the visuals. In the beginning of the video, I asked some questions about how Jorvik being founded by aliens who married into Norsemen or Vikings, depending on what you want to call them, would change the way things are constructed and the way animals look and behave. The reason I asked those questions as a writer, development editor, and world builder in general are those are the questions that need to be answered to give this world and this game an identity that sets it apart from other games. Some type of artistic style, a visual look that I can look at this game and go, oh, that's Star Stable Online. The look for this game is the colorful world of Disney meets Sweden light, with the visual style being a mass market appeal style like Disney, Frozen/Tangled, meets Barbie, meets Fortnite, and depending on the artist doing the work, is going to depend on how the characters fit into those mass appeal, very smooth, and plastic style of graphics. What I mean by Sweden light is I have poked around looking at traditional Swedish houses and looking at Norse houses and looking at their historical buildings and castles, and I can find most of the building inspirations that were used for places like Fort Pinta, the Silverglade Manor, and even some for Firgrove and Dundle, plus the generic medieval and Tuscany styles for other areas of the game. There's even a Georgian-era style castle. Some of these Swedish historical buildings are rooted in other cultures. If the culture and country of the game was Sweden and not Jorvik, I wouldn't care. I would still be a bit baffled by the amount of different building styles in this map I can ride across in less than 10 minutes. I would just shrug and go, oh, it's supposed to be set in Sweden, no big deal. If the target market of the game was really the middle grade they're professing on their website, I wouldn't see too much of the problem with their very candy, very bright, very plastic, mass appeal 3D style. Parts of it are really well done and solid pieces of work. So many building styles, and their clothing styles too are from different eras. I have male Baroque clothing style in my closet. That's not designated as cosplay. It's just what? The buildings and other clothing all feel jumbled together without any thought of making an overall theme between them all. As much as I'd love to say Sweden is a theme, looking at their historical buildings, I'm having a very difficult time coming up with a visual look that says Sweden over Rome or Dane or even to an extent American Southwest. While American colonial, Dutch colonial, and the traditional later Swedish house have a lot in common, it's going to depend on your point of reference. If you see Steve's Red Barn and go Sweden or American Farmer, or you go to Fort Pinta and see this one pink Swedish historical building, or if you see American Southwest, and you'd have to take some time to research to see Dundle and Firgrove are a merging of the log cabin, Norse longhouse, and barn-shaped style Swedish traditional or Dutch colonial, depending on your reference, building. At least it's different. In a nation with a long history, you're going to have a lot of styles. In a video game, you aren't dealing with the reality and you have to present a world with a theme people are going to want to escape into that sets it apart from other games in the market. No one wants to see a WoW 2.0 and realistic graphics because they've got 101 other MMOs now with realistic graphics and the same type of architectural styles as well. So all these buildings with different styles piled onto each other in a small map without a theme makes the game feel like it was developed in pieces rather than as a cohesive world. Putting them into the small maps makes them jumbled rather than if they were spread out over a much bigger map and the styles had times to repeat or evolve. There was no care given to think about how these styles of buildings would be built by people of the culture and beliefs of Jorvik. Think about Harry Potter. Harry Potter has 3 magical places that are touchstones of the entire series. The magical hodgepodge castle of Hogwarts, the magical version Edinburgh's Narrows in Diagon Alley, and the home of the Weasleys' burrow in southwest Britain in Devon. There's a theme. It's very British and mostly medieval at that. It defies physics, and in the books at least, it's very colorful and glamorous to a child's eyes. Star Stable Online doesn't have this really. It has one important place from Starshine Legacy, which is Jorvik's Stables, which I haven't been able to find a one-to-one, but I found a Swedish building that's similar, Gripenberg Castle, the largest wooden castle in Sweden. Jorvik Stables has been giving this Gothic styling with the towers and the ironwork on the tops of the buildings. It's the touch of horror, which is reflected in the twisted tree of Scarecrow Hill. The original Silverglade village was built from bits and pieces of Jorvik Stables and retextured buildings from the Star Stable seasonal games using the textures from Jorvik Stables, until they changed it into the contemporary Swedish houses. So now there is no callback or consistency between Jorvik Stables and Silverglade Village, half a map away. In Starshine Legacy, you had Pine Hill Mansion, which is straight up Second Empire style building. And the third place that Star Stable hasn't actually done a bad job translating is Pandoria, the Pink Hell. Guardiansdale used to be inside Pandoria. You had to take a portal to get to it. Pandoria was supposed to be alien, being pink with large mushroom-like formations and purple tree shapes. I don't know why alien or fantasy usually ends up with big mushrooms somewhere, but here we are. You have to take the alienness of the horse bipedal aliens and of Pandoria and translate it into the common everyday world of the game to make it stand apart from the generic fantasy game, because Moorland and Valedale and Jarlheim and Crescentmoon Village and New Hillcrest medieval buildings, so on and so forth, including our Scottish barony with Lorraine coloring by light in the game of when castles were built, a Silverglade Castle, are all very generic fantasy style buildings. Even to an extent, Firgrove and Dundle, as kind of mixed up as they are, could be considered very generic fantasy. It's very hodgepodge and doesn't really fit tonally with the main story genre. Speaking of tones, the colors are very bright and saturated to try and attract a younger audience. The fastest way to get the colors to fit the story, young adult target market better, would be desaturate a good 90% of them. Because face it, these colors are painful. Saturated colors should pop out, not blend in. Because of the confusion of the genre and the target market, the visual look of the game doesn't have an identity. The world-building questions weren't asked by the studio, and they tried to put their own country's culture where the studio was located, Sweden, in place of creating a culture for the game. It doesn't sit there and go, this is Jorvik, over this is Azeroth, or choose any other generic fantasy game. When the point of a brand is to stand apart from other games, no matter your genre, this is a problem. And the art style is very generic as well. While it has mass appeal, it doesn't seem to have a distinctive art style as a referencing, not oil paintings or watercolor or any type of distinctive digital art. I can see the derivatives of massive corporations and AAA companies. I can't see what makes this the art style of Star Stable Entertainment or of the Jorvik world. It's blah. The logo is also very confusing. It's very childish, rounded, and very pink with the stars and the horse head. It works if they want to attract young children, which they do, but it doesn't work to represent the actual content of the game. It feels like there's a real cognitive dissonance with the marketing over the game they want versus the game they have. We're stumbling into the last portion of the brand, which is the core value and theme of the game, to help create that fantasy tagline to draw people to play the game. Adventure with friends isn't a fantasy tagline. Adventure with friends is every MMO in existence. Due to the nature of how the story is set up, you don't have to adventure with friends in SSO, so it's not even a true fantasy tagline. The core value and theme of the game is the question they are trying to answer of what is this game trying to say? Themes are conveyed through story, what the player goes up against, what they overcome, and the choices they make along the way. Themes can be 1 to 3 words long and may not be apparent to the writer of the story until the story is done, or the player might see themes in a work that the creator of the work didn't put in there. The themes can explain how the player is going to do things, the game mechanics. It is possible to have more than one theme in a work. Usually games have 3 to 5 core values or themes they're trying to focus on. Okay. The themes of Star Stable in the story and what they have said include save the environment, girl empowerment, inclusivity, diversity, and retconned, maybe not retconned, chosen one good versus evil, the light always wins story. At one point in time, I think Star Stable Online had something to say with those themes. And there is potential to those themes. A lot could be done to embrace the really good science fiction horror concept they have and give the player the tools they need, including their genetic abilities, courtesy of a Dean, to defeat Garnak with the support of the Soul Rider Sisterhood. Even if it's just cleaning up GED dump sites around Jorvik to push back what the pollution does to help Garnak anti-industrialism. Not entirely what science fiction is about, but okay. Maybe we could head into solar punk territory with solar panels and wind and water energies, or the alien crystals that have been hinted but not talked about since we went into Epona. The problem with Star Stable Online themes and core game values is what they tell us versus what they show us. They tell us they want this game to be a game about us being included in the Soul Riders. Then we don't do things for the Soul Riders. They tell us that we're special and have all the different Soul Rider powers, making us the reincarnation of a Dean, but we aren't the main character and can't use any skills. There are no in-game mechanics for us to even learn skills either with our alien genetic capabilities or in-game riding mechanics. Anytime something important needs to happen, an enemy needs to be taken down, or a tree needs to be talked to, an NPC is trotted out to do the thing while we watch or play support. I, as a player character, don't really want to be front and center for a boxing match. I also, as a player, don't want to sit for 10 minutes and watch an NPC do it either without having any control over the outcome. They say they want to be diverse, but most of the diversity they've given us is not good and not well executed, and mostly told outside the game to be polite about it, and also not important to the plot in any way. It's hard to feel girl empowerment when most of the female NPCs in the game are downright incompetent and our main skills are run away! And if we're going to go green or save the environment or whatever they're trying to do with the keeper of a Dean's philosophy about nature, those storylines need to actually be explored other than the one storyline of Mr. Sands turns the Lincoln River green and we fixed it. We're good. Because there are plenty of other environmental emergencies around Jorvik to deal with. Hint hint, Old Hillcrest. When you tell something to players and show something else entirely, not only is it bad writing, it's jarring. I'm going to use the word again. It's confusing. When there are no consequences or follow-through with the actions of the players and NPCs in the game, you can't carry through on the theme or core values because there's no growth or progression to any of the characters or storylines. Without the what, we can't implement the how, and without the how, we can't effect change upon the game world and do anything. It's all interconnected, and when the basics aren't defined, then the what we're trying to say simply can't be executed or shown in the story or told in a fantasy tagline, get people hooked into playing the game to do the thing. It just comes off disjointed and messy, and it feels like it needs to be restarted from the concepts of Starshine Legacy, even though the game has been around for 10 years. It's not enough to say what genre and target market you are when you're working on your brand. You, as a game developer team, need to sit there and analyze those genres and age markets for the rules of those genres and what is and isn't acceptable for those genres and different age groups. Then stick to those rules, working within the confines of the genre you've chosen, so you can be as creative as possible with the visuals and the story, and answering the important questions brought up by your game concept. Think about your game as a world rather than as individual spaces. How does it all work together and fit your theme and the story? Otherwise, you end up with a mess, rather than something with a clear and unique vision you can sell. Science fiction horror horse game was and is such a great and unique concept. It's a pity they decided to water it down and disperse and muddle it up with every other idea they could find. But maybe we can learn something from it. Thanks for listening, my lovelies. Take care of yourselves, bless, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.